The golden chandelier in the grand foyer of the Sterling estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, cast a shimmering light that seemed to mock the woman kneeling on the cold marble floor. Martha, at 67 years of age, felt every one of those years in the sharp ache of her joints and the persistent throb in her lower back. Her hands, once skilled at administering delicate intravenous lines as a registered nurse, were now red, chapped, and swollen from the harsh chemicals of industrial-strength floor cleaner. For 32 years, 6 months, and 11 days, she had been the invisible ghost haunting these corridors, a woman who had traded her professional dignity for the role of a sacrificial lamb in a family that viewed her as little more than a piece of inherited furniture. She scrubbed at a stubborn wine stain near the baseboard, a remnant of the lavish fundraiser held the night before, while the echoes of laughter from her son Julian and his brother's wife Victoria drifted down from the mezzanine. Suddenly, a heavy leather dress shoe planted itself firmly on Martha's right hand, pinning her fingers against the hard stone. She gasped, a small cry of pain escaping her thin lips, and looked up to see Julian Sterling staring down at her with an expression of profound boredom. He did not move his foot. Instead, he applied a fraction more pressure, grinding the sole of his expensive Italian loafer into her skin as if he were trying to extinguish a cigarette. He told her to move, stating that she was blocking the path to the library and that her presence was a constant eyesore in a house that was meant for the elegant. He did not apologize. He did not offer a hand to help her up. He simply stepped over her as if she were a pile of discarded rags, his mind already occupied by the millions of dollars he expected to liquidate once the final legalities of his mother's estate were settled. Martha stayed on the floor for a long moment, cradling her bruised hand against her chest, the scent of lemon ammonia stinging her nostrils like the sharp tang of 1,000 betrayals. She remembered the day she had first entered this house, 3 decades ago, when the world felt wide and full of promise. She had been a young, idealistic nurse, and Adelaide Sterling had been a formidable woman, already beginning to feel the first tremors of the illness that would eventually confine her to a wheelchair. Martha had married into the family out of love for a man who had long since passed away, but her real commitment had become the care of the matriarch. For 32 years, Martha had been the only one to change Adelaide's linens, the only one to sit by her bed during the long, screaming nights of pain, and the only one to endure the older woman's legendary vitriol. She had nin-en, skipping her own meals to ensure Adelaide's specific dietary needs were met, and she had taken extra jobs in secret, doing laundry for the neighbors or selling handmade crafts, to pay for the specialized medications that Julian and Victoria claimed the family budget couldn't afford. It was a lie, of course. The Sterling accounts were overflowing with wealth, but Martha was only ever bothy a pittance of $215 a month, a sum so insulting it was clear the family viewed her as a beggar at their table. The physical toll was evident in every line of her face. Her skin was a map of exhaustion, her eyes shadowed by the weight of invisible labor that no one in this house acknowledged. While Victoria spent thousands of dollars on silk gloves to protect her manicured hands, Martha's hands were a testament to her martyrdom, scarred by the chemicals of servitude and the heat of the kitchen. She had been the one to cook the elaborate Thanksgiving dinners, standing for 18 hours until her ankles swelled to twice their size, only to be told by Victoria that the turkey was a fraction too dry or the cranberry sauce lacked the proper zest. She had been a saint in a house of vipers, a sacrificial martyr who believed that if she just suffered long enough, if she just gave enough of her soul, they would eventually see her as a human being. But as she watched Julian disappear into the library, she realized that to them, she was merely a tool that had outlived its usefulness. The atmosphere in the house had become suffocating since Adelaide's passing 1 year ago. The mourning period was a farce, a performance of grief staged for the benefit of the Connecticut Social Register. Julian and Victoria had spent the last 12 months treating the estate like a carcass to be picked clean, squabbling over the fine china and the oil paintings, while Martha continued to serve them their morning coffee and evening scotch. They spoke of her in the third person, even when she was in the room, discussing her future as if she were a stray dog they were considering dropping at a shelter. They would say that the Martha problem needed to be addressed, and that the cost of keeping her in the main house was no longer justifiable. They had no memory of the nights she had stayed awake to monitor Adelaide's breathing, or the way she had shielded them from the old woman's worst rages. All they saw was a 67-year-old woman who represented a drain on their inheritance. Martha stood up slowly, her knees cracking like dry kindling. She gathered her bucket and rags, moving toward the kitchen where the air was always heavy with the smell of the past. In this room, she had made magic out of every cent, stretching the meager allowance she was given to feed a family that never once thanked her. She looked at the scars on her palms, small white lines from knife slips during late-night meal prep and burns from the ancient stove that Julian refused to replace. She had been the pillar of this home, the silent nurse who healed their wounds and absorbed their toxins, yet she was being discarded with less thought than one would give to an old newspaper. The injustice of it was a cold, hard lump in her throat, a bitterness that no amount of prayer could dissolve. She had been the invisible glue holding the Sterling legacy together, and now that the matriarch was gone, the Vipers were ready to strike. Every room in the mansion held a memory of a sacrifice she had made. In the parlor, she had sold her own mother's heirloom locket to pay for a repair on the roof that Julian had neglected, claiming he was short on liquid assets while he bought a new Porsche. In the garden, she had spent hundreds of hours tending to the roses because they were the only thing that brought a smile to Adelaide's face, even as the thorns tore at her skin and the sun scorched her neck. She had given up her own dreams of traveling, her own desires for a quiet life, all to be the caretaker of a woman who had treated her like a servant and a family that treated her like an intruder. The long-suffering Uuat had become her primary identity, a cloak of sorrow she wore every day as she moved through the drafty halls of the Greenwich estate. As the sun began to set over the rolling hills of Connecticut, casting long, skeletal shadows across the lawn, Martha found herself in the small, cramped room she occupied in the attic. It was a space intended for a maid in the 1920s, poorly insulated and smelling of damp wood. This was her reward for 32 years of devotion. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her heart pounding with a mixture of exhaustion and a growing, flickering spark of resentment that she had tried for so long to extinguish. She looked at a faded photograph of herself from 3 decades ago. She had been beautiful then, with light in her eyes and hope in her smile. Now she was a ghost, a woman whose dignity had been eroded by the constant drip of humiliation. But as she closed her eyes, she heard the words of her late husband in her mind, a promise that truth always finds its way to the light. The sacrifice had been absolute, the suffering had been profound, but the finale of this Latin-styled tragedy was only just beginning to take shape in the darkness of the Sterling house. The evening air brought a chill that seemed to seep through the very stones of the mansion. Martha walked down to the kitchen to begin preparing the dinner that Julian and Victoria demanded at precisely 7 o'clock. She moved with a practiced, robotic grace, her mind drifting back to the thousands of times she had performed these same actions. She had peeled 1,000,000 potatoes, scrubbed 1,000 pots, and swallowed 10,000 insults. She remembered a Christmas 10 years ago when she had spent her last $40 to buy Julian a set of crystal cufflinks, only to see him give them to his valet the very next day because they weren't of a high enough caliber. She remembered Victoria's laugh when Martha had tripped on a loose rug while carrying a heavy tray, a laugh that was sharp, metallic, and devoid of any empathy. These were the bricks that built her prison of resentment, a wall that had grown so high she could no longer see the sun. She was the sacrificial martyr, the one who bore the sins of the family on her narrow shoulders. She had protected Julian's reputation when he had been involved in a minor scandal in the city, and she had lied for Victoria when the woman had spent money they didn't have on a reckless investment. Martha had been their confidant, their nurse, and their punching bag, and in return, they were preparing to throw her out into the cold Connecticut winter with nothing but her chapped hands and her broken heart. But as she stirred the soup, she felt a strange new sensation, a coldness in her blood that wasn't from the drafty windows. It was the coldness of a woman who had reached the absolute limit of her endurance, a woman who was tired of being a saint in a house of devils. The promise of justice was the only thing that kept her heart beating, a silent vow that the invisible nurse would one day be seen, and the Vipers would finally feel the weight of their own cruelty. The dinner was served in the formal dining room, a space filled with the heavy scents of mahogany and expensive wine. Julian and Victoria sat at opposite ends of the long table, the distance between them filled with their shared greed. Martha moved around them like a shadow, placing plates with silent precision, her eyes downcast as she endured their casual disparagement. They talked about her as if she were a piece of equipment that was failing. Julian mentioned that the upkeep on Martha was becoming a nuisance, while Victoria complained that the silver wasn't as polished as it used to be. Martha stood by the sideboard, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her apron, her heart a heavy stone in her chest. She had given them everything, her youth, her health, her pride, and they were debating her worth as if she were a used car. The agony was no longer just a dull ache, it was a sharp, burning fire that threatened to consume her. As the meal ended, Julian looked at Martha and told her to clear the table quickly, as they had important matters to discuss that didn't concern her. He used the tone he would use for a dog that had soiled the carpet. Martha bowed her head, gathered the crystal glasses and the fine china, and retreated to the kitchen. She stood by the sink, the hot water scalding her already damaged hands. But she didn't flinch. The pain was a reminder that she was still alive, still capable of feeling something other than the crushing weight of their ingratitude. She looked out the window at the dark woods surrounding the estate, the same woods she had walked through with Adelaide in better times. She knew that the storm was coming, not just a storm of wind and rain, but a storm of reckoning. The invisible nurse was about to become the architect of their downfall, and the 32 years of sacrifice were about to be tallied in a ledger that Julian and Victoria could never hope to balance. She thought of her hands again, the hands that had nursed a dying woman, the hands that had built a home for people who hated her, and the hands that were now red and raw from the labor of servitude. These hands were the evidence of her martyrdom, the physical proof of a life spent in the service of others. They were hands that had known only toil and pain, but they were also hands that held the potential for a terrible, righteous justice. As she dried the last plate, she felt a sense of calm settle over her. The sacrifice was over. The long suffering was reaching its zenith. The stage was being set for a public retribution that would shake the very foundations of Greenwich, and Martha, the woman they had stepped on for 32 years, would be the one to pull the curtain. Martha walked back to the attic, each step a deliberate act of defiance against the gravity of her exhaustion. She lay down on her bed, the thin mattress offering little comfort, but she didn't care. The images of the day played in her mind like a tragic film. Julian's foot on her hand, Victoria's mocking smile, the cold marble of the foyer. She was the sacrificial martyr of the Sterling family, a woman who had been hollowed out by the needs of others until there was nothing left but a shell of duty. But inside that shell, a fire was beginning to burn, a fire fueled by 32 years of accumulated insults and 1,000 nights of lonely tears. She was no longer just a nurse or a servant. She was a woman waiting for the divine justice that had been promised to her. The vipers in the rooms below had no idea that the woman they had treated like a ghost was about to haunt them in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. The house was silent now, but it was the silence of a held breath. Martha looked at the ceiling, her eyes following the cracks in the plaster that looked like lightning bolts. She had neen en, she had worked kadem, and she had sacrificed every shred of her self-respect to keep this family afloat. She had been the bridge they walked over to reach their luxurious lives, and now they were ready to burn that bridge behind them. But Martha knew something they didn't. She knew that bridges can only be burned once, and when they fall, they take everything on top of them down into the abyss. The sacrifice was complete, the suffering was tallied, and the invisible nurse was ready to step out of the shadows. The Latin heart within her, though bruised and battered, was beating with a new, dangerous rhythm, the rhythm of a goddess of vengeance preparing for her final act. Martha's thoughts drifted to her late husband, the one link to a life where she was loved and cherished. He had died young, leaving her at the mercy of the Sterling family, but he had always told her that her goodness was her greatest strength. For a long time, she had thought that meant she had to endure their cruelty with a smile, to be the Vithan Trumjedin that everyone expected her to be. But as she stared into the darkness of her attic room, she realized that true goodness also requires the courage to demand justice. She had been a martyr for 32 years, 6 months, and 11 days, and that was more than enough for any soul to bear. The Vipers had underestimated the invisible nurse, and soon the entire world would see the cost of their arrogance. The sacrifice was the first part of the hymn, and the notes were beginning to rise toward a crescendo of fire and truth. In the morning, the cycle would begin again, the scrubbing, the cooking, the insults. But Martha knew it would be different this time. Each task would be a step toward the end, each moment of suffering a deposit in the bank of retribution. She looked at her chapped, aching hands and whispered a silent prayer, not for strength to endure, but for the clarity to execute the judgment that was coming. The Sterling estate was a monument to greed and ingratitude, and Martha was the only one who knew where the foundations were weak. The sacrificial lamb was done being slaughtered. She was ready to become the lion. The long-suffering Uuat was transforming into a cold, clinical precision, and the woman who had been a ghost in her own home was finally preparing to live. The hymn of suffering was ending, and the anthem of justice was about to begin. The cold morning light of Greenwich filtered through the tall windows of the Sterling mansion, but it brought no warmth to the stone-cold reality of Martha's existence. 1 year had passed since Adelaide Sterling had drawn her final breath, and the atmosphere in the house had shifted from a place of illness to a den of vultures. Martha moved through the halls with the silent efficiency of a shadow, her body aching with the familiar weight of 32 years of servitude. She had spent the last 12 months as a nurse to a memory, maintaining the house as if the matriarch might return at any moment, only to be reminded daily by Julian and Victoria that she was a relic of a past they were desperate to erase. The memorial gala was approaching, a grand event meant to celebrate Adelaide's legacy, but Martha knew it was merely a stage for Julian to announce his political ambitions and for Victoria to flaunt a wealth she had done nothing to earn. Martha's role, as always, was to facilitate their brilliance from the darkness of the kitchen and the dampness of the laundry room. The betrayal began not with a scream, but with the clinical rustle of paper. Martha was in the pantry, organizing the artisanal preserves Victoria had ordered for the gala, when she heard the heavy, arrogant footsteps of Julian entering the kitchen. He wasn't alone. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of Victoria's designer heels followed him like the ticking of a countdown clock. They didn't even check to see if she was there. To them, the kitchen was a utility space, and anyone in it was merely part of the plumbing. Julian's voice was cold, stripped of even the basic veneer of politeness he usually maintained in public. He told Victoria that the realtor from the luxury firm would be arriving at 10 in the morning to do the final walkthrough, as the house was officially going on the market the day after the gala. Victoria laughed, a sound like glass breaking, and added that she couldn't wait to be rid of the lingering smell of sickness and cheap soap. She then asked what they were going to do with the help, referring to the woman who had raised Julian and nursed his mother. Julian's response was a knife to Martha's heart, twisted with the precision of a man who viewed people as liabilities to be liquidated. He stated that he had already looked into a state-run facility in a dilapidated corner of New Jersey, a place for those who had no assets and no future. He called it a social housing solution, but Martha knew what it was, a dumping ground for the forgotten. He said that Martha was an anchor, dragging down the value of the Sterling name, and that her continued presence in the house was a charity project that had reached its expiration date. She stood frozen behind the pantry door, her breath hitching in her throat, her scarred hands gripping a jar of jam so hard the glass threatened to shatter. This was the son she had comforted during his childhood night terrors. This was the family she had nin-en and worked kadam for, sacrificing her own health to ensure their comfort. And now they were discussing her eviction as if they were deciding which pieces of junk to send to the landfill. Victoria chimed in with a suggestion that was even more poisonous, noting that they should make sure Martha signed the voluntary departure papers before the gala, so there would be no legal complications. She didn't want a scene while the governor was in the house. She laughed about how Martha was too simple-minded to understand what she was signing, and would likely be grateful for the gift of a small room in a government building. Martha's heart felt like it was being crushed by a cold iron hand. 32 years, 6 months, and 11 days of devotion were being discarded for the sake of a clean real estate transaction. The agony of this realization was physical, a wave of nausea that made the world tilt on its axis. She was the sacrificial martyr who had given her life to build their sanctuary, only to find that the doors were being locked against her from the inside. As they left the kitchen, the silence that followed was heavier than any noise. Martha stepped out of the pantry, her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed in their presence. She looked at the kitchen, the place where she had spent tens of thousands of hours preparing meals that were never praised. She saw the marks on the floor where Julian had stepped on her hand just days prior, and she felt a surge of UC that was so intense it felt like fire in her veins. She was not just a servant. She was the woman who had held Adelaide's hand when she died, the woman who knew every secret and every shame of the Sterling family. Yet to Julian and Victoria, she was an eyesore, a vet NO on their pristine social standing. The contrast between the hundreds of thousands of dollars they spent on a single night's party and the $215 they gave her as a monthly pittance was a gap that could never be bridged by anything other than total retribution. The day of the walkathrough arrived, and Martha was forced to endure the ultimate humiliation. Julian and the realtor, a woman dressed in a suit that cost more than Martha's annual allowance, paraded through the house. They entered Martha's small attic room without knocking. Julian gestured to her meager belongings, the faded photographs, the few books she owned, the small wooden cross her husband had given her, and told the realtor that this area would be cleared out immediately to make room for a climate-controlled wine cellar. He spoke as if Martha weren't standing right there, clutching a bundle of dirty linens to her chest. He described her as a long-term guest who was moving on to better accommodations. The realtor nodded, her eyes sliding over Martha with a mixture of pity and condescension, before noting that the servant vibe was definitely a detractor for modern buyers. Martha felt like a ghost, a remnant of a past that was being paved over by the greed of the present. That evening, Victoria summoned Martha to the library. The room was filled with the smell of old leather and the expensive cigar smoke Julian favored. Victoria was holding a stack of legal documents, her face set in a mask of artificial concern. She sat Martha down and told her that, for her own protection, she needed to sign these papers. She claimed that the Sterling family was setting up a trust for her, but Martha's nurse-trained eyes caught the words "waiver of all claims" and "notice of eviction" at the top of the pages. Victoria lied with the ease of a professional, telling Martha that the new facility in New Jersey was like a resort and that she would be much happier there with people of her own class. Martha looked at the pen Victoria was pushing toward her, a gold-plated instrument that felt like a weapon. Every muscle in Martha's body screamed to fight back, but she remembered the Latin U-shape of her destiny. She had to endure. She had to let the UATUC accumulate until it was a tidal wave. She told Victoria she needed a few days to process the excitement, her voice trembling with a well-acted frailty that made Victoria smirk with victory. The betrayal extended to the memory of the dead. Later that night, Martha found Julian and Victoria in the master suite, going through Adelaide's jewelry boxes. These were pieces that Adelaide had explicitly told Martha should be handled with care, heirlooms with stories attached to them. Julian was tossing them into velvet bags with the callousness of a thief. He picked up a sapphire brooch, one that Martha had searched for hours to find when Adelaide had misplaced it during her dementia phase, and remarked that it would pay for the catering of the Gala's VIP lounge. Victoria was trying on a diamond necklace, admiring herself in the mirror, while she joked that the old bat wouldn't need them where she was going. Martha stood in the doorway, unseen, watching them desecrate the legacy of the woman who had given them everything. The greed was palpable, a thick, greasy layer of entitlement that covered everything they touched. Martha realized then that there was no bottom to their depravity. They would sell their own mother's soul if the price were right. Martha returned to her attic room, the cold air of the Connecticut night seeping through the eaves. She sat on her bed and looked at her hands, the hands that had cleaned Julian's scraped knees and washed Victoria's expensive silk dresses. These hands had sacrificed their youth and their beauty for a family that viewed her as a disposal unit. She thought about the 32 years of invisible labor, the nights she had nien so the children could have the best cuts of meat, the birthdays she had spent alone in the kitchen so they could have perfect parties. She was the Vithan Trongjadin, the martyr who had swallowed every insult and buried every pain. But the long suffering was reaching a boiling point. The plan to move her to a state facility, to strip her of her dignity and her home, was the final spark. The Latin soul within her, the one that thrived on honor and respect, was screaming for justice. The next few days were a blur of cold betrayal. Julian began to move Martha's things out of the attic without her permission, piling her life into cardboard boxes in the garage. He told her she was cluttering the aesthetic for the upcoming guests. Every time she saw a box, she saw a piece of her soul being discarded. She found her wedding photo, the only one she had, tossed in a bin near the trash cans, the glass cracked across her late husband's face. She rescued it, her heart breaking into 1,000 jagged pieces. She held the broken frame to her chest, sobbing silently in the shadows of the garage, while Julian's laughter echoed from the patio where he was drinking expensive scotch with his business partners. He was celebrating his future, a future built on the broken back of the woman who had nurtured him. The injustice was so vast, so overwhelming, that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her lungs. Victoria's cruelty was more psychological. She began to treat Martha as if she were already senile, speaking loudly and slowly to her in front of the catering staff, making jokes about how Martha's memory was failing. She told the head of the catering team to watch the silverware because Martha might get confused and hide it. Martha endured it all with a bowed head, her silence interpreted as weakness, when in reality it was the silence of a bomb being armed. She watched Victoria spend $52,000 on floral arrangements for the gala, a sum that would have provided Martha with a comfortable retirement for the rest of her life, and she felt the UATUC turn into a cold, hard resolve. They were throwing her out with nothing, not even the dignity of a thank you after 3 decades of sacrifice. The sacrificial martyr was being prepared for the altar, but the Vipers didn't realize that the altar was hers, not theirs. The contrast between the wealth of the Sterling estate and Martha's forced poverty was a constant scream in her ears. The house was being filled with cases of champagne that cost $700 a bottle, while Martha was told to cut back on her use of hot water to save on the utility bill. Julian had hired a private security firm for the gala, paying them $42,000 to protect his prestigious guests, while he told Martha that there was no room in the budget for her to have a proper medical checkup for her arthritis. The hypocrisy was a suffocating fog. Martha moved through the rooms, polishing the mahogany and dusting the crystal, knowing that every surface she touched was something she was being forbidden from ever seeing again. She was the ghost of the Sterling house, a phantom of labor that they were trying to exorcise with legal papers and insults. On the night before the gala, the house was a hive of activity. Martha was ordered to stay in the kitchen and out of the way, but she was tasked with cleaning the mud tracked in by the workers, a task that required her to be on her knees for 5 hours straight. As she scrubbed the foyer, Julian walked by with a group of his friends, influential men from the city. He laughed and told them that good help is so hard to find these days, you practically have to treat them like family just to get the floors clean. His friends chuckled, their expensive shoes clicking inches away from Martha's bruised fingers. The humiliation was a white-hot brand on her soul. She looked up and caught Julian's eye for a split second, and in that moment she saw the truth. He didn't just want her gone, he wanted her destroyed. He wanted to erase the evidence of his mother's illness and Martha's sacrifice so he could pretend he had built his empire alone. Victoria entered the foyer then, draped in a gown that cost $24,000, and told Martha to hurry up and finish so the space can be sprayed for odors. She treated the woman who had cared for her during her own bouts of pneumonia as if she were a carrier of a plague. The cold betrayal was complete. They had stripped Martha of her role, her home, her history, and now they were stripping her of her basic humanity. Martha stood up, her legs trembling, her heart a cold, dead weight. She walked toward the kitchen, her mind a whirlwind of agony and memory. She thought of Adelaide, the woman who had been her tormentor, but also her only companion. She wondered if Adelaide had known it would come to this. She wondered if the betrayal was something the matriarch had foreseen. As Martha sat in her cold attic room that final night before the gala, surrounded by the cardboard boxes of her life, she felt the Latin U shape of her journey reaching its lowest point. She was at the bottom of the curve, in the deepest darkness of the valley of suffering. She had nothing left to lose. They had taken her pride, her health, and now they were taking her future. But in the silence of the night, she heard the words of a prayer she had long since forgotten, a prayer for the truth to be a sword and for the humble to be exalted. The vipers in the master suite were sleeping the sleep of the entitled, unaware that the invisible nurse was still awake. The sacrifice was over. The betrayal was documented. The stage for the divine justice was being set, and the first act of the retribution was only a phone call away. The weight of the $115,000 Julian had spent on the gala's publicity alone sat in Martha's mind like a mocking tally. That money could have saved her, could have given her the quiet life she deserved, but instead, it was being used to buy the admiration of people who didn't care if she lived or died. The injustice of the $215 she received each month compared to the $75 million the estate was worth was a gap that only a cataclysm could fill. Martha looked at her red, chapped hands in the moonlight, and for the first time in 32 years, she didn't feel pain. She felt a cold, clinical detachment. The sacrificial martyr had been burned at the stake of their greed, but from the ashes, something else was rising. The storm was no longer silent. It was a roaring in her ears, a demand for a reckoning that would leave the sterling name in ruins. Martha lay down on her thin mattress, but she didn't sleep. She watched the clock, each second a heartbeat in the countdown to the gala. She knew that tomorrow, Julian and Victoria would stand before the elite of Connecticut and tell a story of legacy and honor. And she knew that she would be the one to tell the true story, the story of the invisible nurse who had been stepped on, lied to, and discarded like trash. The cold betrayal had given her the one thing she never thought she'd have, the freedom to be their worst nightmare. The sacrifice was the foundation, the betrayal was the wall, and tomorrow the roof of the Sterling house would come crashing down on the vipers who had built it out of the bones of a saint. The morning of the lawyer's call was draped in a relentless charcoal-gray rain that hammered against the attic shingles of the Sterling estate like the insistent tapping of 1,000 restless souls. Martha sat on the edge of her bed, her heart a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs, staring at the black screen of her government-subsidized phone. The message from Mr. Harrison, the senior partner at Harrison & Finch and the longtime executor of the Sterling legal affairs, had been brief but formal. He requested her presence at his office in downtown Greenwich at exactly 2 p.m. Julian and Victoria had already left the house for a pre-gala brunch with the mayor, leaving Martha with a list of chores that would take a dozen women to complete, yet she ignored the vacuum cleaner and the silver polish. She felt a strange magnetic pull toward this meeting, a sense that the 32 years, 6 months, and 11 days of her silent martyrdom were converging toward a single, shattering point of truth. She dressed in the only respectable garment she owned, a dark navy wool coat that she had purchased at a thrift store 10 years ago for $12, and walked out into the rain. She didn't dare take one of the family's cars. Julian would have reported her for grand theft before she reached the end of the driveway. Instead, she walked to the bus stop, her shoes soaking through, her body shivering not from the cold, but from the terrifying anticipation of what was to come. She entered the mahogany-paneled sanctuary of Mr. Harrison's office, feeling like a speck of dust in a museum of power. Mr. Harrison, a man whose face was etched with the gravity of 1,000 secrets, did not treat her like a servant. He stood up when she entered, his eyes filled with a sadness that made Martha's stomach churn. He offered her a seat and a cup of tea, his hands steady as he placed a heavy, rusted iron box on the desk between them. He told her that Adelaide had left specific instructions that this box was to be opened only by Martha, and only 1 year after her passing, if certain conditions of betrayal were met by the heirs. With hands that shook so violently she nearly dropped the small brass key Mr. Harrison provided, Martha unlocked the box. Inside, she found no gold or jewels, but something far more valuable, a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by the grip of a woman who had spent decades hiding her heart. Beneath the journal lay a single thick manila envelope addressed to the Saint of the Kitchen. Martha opened the journal first, and as she read the elegant, spidery script of Adelaide Sterling, the world around her began to dissolve. The first entry was dated 32 years ago, the week Martha had married into the family. Adelaide wrote that she had seen the purity in Martha's eyes and felt an immediate, crushing guilt. She confessed that she knew her son Julian was born with a hollow soul, a man who viewed love as a transaction and loyalty as a weakness. Adelaide had spent 30 years pretending to be a monster, treating Martha with a calculated harshness to harden her against the even greater cruelty Julian would eventually unleash once he held the checkbook. "My dearest Martha," the journal continued in an entry from 5 years ago, "every time I insulted your cooking, I wept in private because your food was the only thing that tasted of love in this cold house. Every time I demanded you work through the night, it was to ensure Julian saw you as indispensable, so he wouldn't discard you before I could finish my final plan. I have been your tormentor so that I could be your shield. Please, forgive a dying woman for her cowardice." Martha's tears fell onto the aged paper, blurring the ink of a woman she had thought hated her. The heart shattered was not from pain, but from the realization that she had been loved in a way so twisted and secret, it was its own form of tragedy. Adelaide had watched every sacrifice, had noted every skipped meal, and had documented every time Julian had stepped on Martha's dignity. The journal was a ledger of every $103,000 Julian had embezzled from his mother's accounts while she lay dying, and every time Victoria had stolen jewelry from the safe while Martha was busy changing Adelaide's bandages. Then Martha opened the manila envelope. It contained the divine justice she never dared to dream of. There were bank statements from Swiss accounts holding exactly $42,608,000, all in Martha's name. There were deeds to properties in Barcelona, a villa in the south of France, and a luxury apartment in Manhattan, all purchased silently by Adelaide over 30 years and placed into a blind trust for which Martha was the sole beneficiary. But the most devastating document was a secret codicil to the Sterling will. It stated that because Julian and Victoria had initiated the eviction of the caretaker and had conspired to declare Adelaide incompetent while she was still lucid, they were to be stripped of every cent of their expected $75 million inheritance. They were to be left with the Naukalpen house, which Adelaide had intentionally hypothecated to the hilt, leaving them with a debt of $2 million instead of a fortune. Martha felt the floor of her reality collapse. The 32 years of long suffering were not a mistake. They were the price of a kingdom. She looked at Mr. Harrison, who was now playing a digital recording on a small laptop. It was a hidden camera from Adelaide's bedroom, recorded just weeks before her death. On the screen, Martha saw Julian leaning over his mother's frail body, his voice a hiss of pure venom as he told her to die faster so he could sell the house and put the nurse in the trash where she belongs. She saw Victoria laughing as she tried on Adelaide's pearls while the old woman struggled for breath. The heart shattered turned into a cold, crystalline anger. The sacrifice was over. The martyr had been given the sword of truth. Martha realized that the $115,000 Julian was currently spending on the Gala's floral arrangements was money he didn't actually have. He was spending Martha's money, and he was doing it while planning to toss her into a state-run slum. Mr. Harrison explained the legal mechanism of the silent storm. Every account Julian was currently using had been flagged for months. The moment Martha signed the final acceptance papers in this room, those accounts would freeze like ice in a Connecticut winter. The $75 million would vanish from Julian's reach, replaced by a legal notice of foreclosure on the very house they were standing in. Martha picked up the gold pen, the same type of pen Victoria had tried to use to trick her into signing her own eviction, and signed her name with a precision that was terrifying. She wasn't just signing for wealth. She was signing the death warrant of the Viper's social standing. She asked Mr. Harrison to keep the news quiet for 3 more days. She wanted the divine reckoning to happen on the grandest stage of all, the memorial gala. As Martha left the office and walked back into the rain, she didn't feel the wetness of her clothes. She felt the weight of the journal in her bag, a physical manifestation of the truth. She returned to the mansion, entering through the servant's door as she always did, but her posture was no longer bowed. She found Julian in the foyer, screaming at a caterer over the vintage of the champagne. When he saw Martha, he snarled at her to go clean the bathrooms in the guest wing, telling her that she should get used to scrubbing toilets, because that's all she'd be doing in New Jersey. Martha looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't feel fear. She felt a profound, icy pity. She saw a man who had sold his soul for a $75 million dream that was already a nightmare. She walked away without a word, her silence a thunderclap he was too arrogant to hear. In her attic room that night, Martha read the journal until the sun began to peek over the horizon. Adelaide had documented the accidental heartbreak of her life, how she had watched her own son become a monster, and how she had placed all her hope for the sterling legacy in the hands of the woman she had once called a peasant. Adelaide wrote, "Martha, you are the only one who ever saw me as a person and not a bank account. They will try to break you. They will try to steal your dignity. But I have given you the keys to their cage. Use them." Martha clutched the journal to her chest, her tears finally drying into a hard, unforgiving resolve. The sacrificial martyr was gone. In her place sat a woman who possessed $42 million in liquid assets and the secrets of a century. The heart shattered had been rebuilt into a fortress of justice. The next 48 hours were a silent storm of preparation. Martha performed her chores with a chilling calmness that Victoria mistook for senility. While Victoria bragged on the phone about the $82,000 gown she was wearing to the gala, Martha was quietly coordinating with Mr. Harrison to have private security and a team of forensic accountants ready for the divine reckoning. She watched Julian and Victoria move through the house with the confidence of kings, unaware that the very air they breathed was now owned by the woman they called Yvette Neo. Martha looked at her chapped hands one last time and smiled. These hands had built the Sterling Empire through labor, and now they would dismantle it with a single page of text. The heart shattered was the final price she would ever pay for their greed. The reckoning was no longer coming. It was already there, hidden in the ink of a dead woman's diary and the silent resolve of a saint who had decided to become a judge. She thought of the $215 Julian had handed her that morning, telling her it was her severance pay and that she should be grateful for his generosity. She had taken the money with a polite thank you, knowing that in less than 24 hours, she would be the one deciding if he could even afford a bus ticket out of town. The contrast between his petty cruelty and her massive hidden power was almost intoxicating. She felt the Latin soul within her surging, the demand for respect, the sanctity of the family, and the fire of public retribution. The vipers were dancing on the edge of a cliff, and Martha was the only one who knew the ground was made of shadows. The heart shattered was the last stage of her suffering. The next stage was the divine reckoning, and it would be a hymn of fire that Greenwich would never forget. Martha sat in the dark of her attic on the eve of the gala, the journal open to the last page. Adelaide's final entry was a single sentence: "Win the bet, Martha." Martha realized then that the bet wasn't about money. It was about whether Martha would have the courage to claim the power she had earned through 32 years of pain. She stood up, her back straight, her eyes clear. She was no longer the invisible nurse. She was the heir to the Sterling legacy, the keeper of the truth, and the goddess of the coming storm. The vipers would have their party, they would have their champagne, and they would have their applause. And then Martha would have her justice. The heart-shattered part of the tragedy was over. The victim had died in the rain, and the victor had been born in the study of a lawyer. As she looked out at the twinkling lights of the wealthy Connecticut estates, Martha whispered a promise to the woman in the journal. "I will win, Adelaide, and they will finally see what the peasant is made of." The rain had stopped, and the air was clear and cold. filled with the scent of pine and the electric charge of a coming execution. The sterling name was about to be redefined, not by the blood of the vipers, but by the hands of the nurse who had kept their hearts beating just long enough to see them fall. The house was filled with the frantic, high-pitched energy of a theater troupe preparing for its final, most expensive performance. Martha moved through the hallways of the Sterling estate like a silent, invisible spirit, her presence so familiar that Julian and Victoria had long ago stopped acknowledging her as a living being. For 32 years, she had been the unseen gear in the family's clockwork, but as the night of the memorial gala approached, the silent storm began to gather within her soul. She spent her days performing the tasks they demanded, but every movement was now calculated, every bowed head a mask for the divine justice she was preparing to deliver. She watched as Julian paced the library, barking orders into his phone about the $82,000 lighting rig and the $115,000 he had committed to public relations to ensure the event was the talk of the Connecticut Social Register. He believed he was spending the sterling fortune. He had no idea he was actually spending Martha's. In the kitchen, while Victoria obsessed over the texture of the $400 truffles being flown in from France, Martha was quietly coordinating with Mr. Harrison through a series of encrypted messages. She had become a master of the double life, a skill she had perfected during those long years of invisible labor when she had learned to hide her pain behind a pleasant smile. The silent storm was not one of noise, but of precise, clinical extraction. With a single authorization from the accounts Mr. Harrison had revealed, Martha began the process of the disconnect. She systematically revoked the spending privileges on the secondary accounts Julian used to fund his lavish lifestyle. She watched from the shadows as he grew increasingly frustrated when his corporate credit card was declined by the florist, then by the valet service. He brushed it off as a clerical error, his arrogance acting as a shield against the truth that his foundation was already crumbling. The Bua Toi Dinan Ngum happened 48 hours before the gala. Julian and Victoria sat at the mahogany table for what they believed was a standard meal, but for Martha, it was a silent trial. She served them a traditional beef Wellington, a dish that required hours of meticulous preparation, her hands steady despite the cold fire burning in her chest. As they ate, she stood by the sideboard, listening to them laugh about her impending eviction. Victoria joked that they should leave a $215 tip for the social worker who would be taking Martha to New Jersey, while Julian suggested they film the moment she saw the state-run facility just for the entertainment value. Martha looked at them, really looked at them, and felt a profound, icy detachment. They were no longer her family. They were subjects of an investigation, vipers who had mistaken her silence for submission. She knew that every bite they took was a debt being tallied, every laugh a sentence being signed. During that dinner, Martha practiced the silent storm by subtly reclaiming her power. When Julian snapped his fingers for more wine, she didn't rush. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace that made him look at her with a fleeting moment of confusion. He told her she was getting slow in her old age, but he didn't see the coldness in her eyes that mirrored the steel of a scalpel. She was no longer a servant. She was a judge presiding over a final meal. She had spent 32 years, 6 months, and 11 days putting their needs before her own, and this was the last time she would ever perform this dance. She thought about the $75 million they were so certain was theirs, and the $42 million that was currently being transferred into an unbreakable trust that would never see a single cent of sterling blood. The silence in the room was a weapon, and she was the only one who knew how to wield it. After dinner, Julian attempted to corner Martha in the hallway, thrusting a new set of property transfer documents at her. He told her that he had streamlined the process and that she needed to sign them tonight so the house could be sold to the developers as soon as the gala ended. He didn't even look at the bandages on her fingers, the fingers he had crushed just days before. He told her she was a burden and that she should be grateful he was even providing her with a roof for another 48 hours. Martha took the papers, her voice a whisper of silent storm calm, as she told him she would review them in her room. Julian sneered, calling her a pretentious peasant, and walked away to join Victoria in the parlor. Martha didn't go to her room. She went to the library, where she used the house's industrial-grade shredder to turn his $75 million dreams into confetti. The next day, the silent storm intensified. Martha spent the morning working with a team of private investigators Mr. Harrison had hired to secure the house. She knew that once the divine reckoning occurred, Julian would likely attempt to destroy the property or harm her. She had silent alarms installed in the attic and the kitchen, and she arranged for a security detail to be disguised as catering staff during the gala. While Julian was busy rehearsing his speech about family values and the sterling legacy, Martha was memorizing the exit routes and the protocols for a lockdown. She felt like a Nuthen Bauthu, a goddess of vengeance who was meticulously building a trap for the vipers. She thought about the $103,000 Julian had stolen from Adelaide's medical fund, and she felt a surge of righteous anger that gave her the strength to scrub the floors one last time with a smile that was sharp as a razor. Victoria spent the afternoon in a state of high-strung panic, screaming at the decorators because the $52,000 floral arrangements were the wrong shade of white. She treated Martha like a leper, ordering her to stay in the service quarters so her drab appearance wouldn't contaminate the aesthetic of the preparations. Martha simply bowed her head and retreated, her mind focused on the silent storm of financial ruin she had already unleashed. She had spent the last 24 hours working with forensic accountants to map every single dollar Julian had misappropriated. She had the bank records, the hidden wire transfers, and the evidence of the $2 million debt he was about to inherit. The contrast between Victoria's vanity and the reality of her impending bankruptcy was a tragic melodrama that Martha was orchestrating with clinical precision. The night before the gala, the house was a tomb of secrets. Martha sat in her attic, her Latin soul resonating with the weight of the coming justice. She looked at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror, the face of a sacrificial martyr who had finally reached the end of her endurance. She wasn't just tired anymore, she was resolved. She thought about the 32 years of long suffering and realized that every insult she had swallowed had been fuel for the silent storm. She was no longer the nurse who healed. She was the nurse who diagnosed a terminal condition. The Sterling family was a cancer, and she was the surgery that would remove it. She felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in decades, a tranquility that came from knowing that the divine reckoning was inevitable and absolute. On the morning of this gala, the silent storm was at its peak. The accounts were fully frozen. Julian's law firm had been notified of irregularities in his handling of the estate. The developers who had agreed to buy the house were sent a cease and desist order because the property was no longer legally for sale by the person who signed the contract. And through it all, Martha served them breakfast. She brought Julian his coffee and Victoria her green tea, watching them discuss their plans for the $75 million, as if the money were already in their hands. They spoke of buying a yacht, of moving to the city, of finally being free of the nurse. Martha's heart was a drum, beating out the rhythm of their downfall. She saw Julian look at his watch, the $30,000 timepiece that belonged to Martha, and she smiled to herself. Time was up. The final silent storm action happened 3 hours before the guests arrived. Martha walked into the master suite, where Victoria was being dressed by a team of stylists. Victoria didn't even look at her, merely telling her to take the trash out the back way. Martha didn't argue. She walked to the safe in the wall, the one Julian thought only he could open, and used the code Adelaide had written in her journal. She removed the sapphire brooch and the diamond necklace they had planned to use for their own vanity. She replaced them with high-quality replicas she had obtained through Mr. Harrison, ensuring that the vipers would be wearing fake jewels to match their fake lives at the gala. She felt a surge of divine justice as she tucked the real heirlooms into her apron. These belonged to the saint of the kitchen, not the vultures of the mezzanine. As the sun began to set on the day of the gala, Martha dressed for the silent storm. She didn't wear her rags. She wore a simple, elegant black dress that had been hidden in Adelaide's wardrobe for years, a dress that smelled of the late matriarch and of divine reckoning. She looked at her hands, still red and chapped, but now they were steady. She was no longer afraid of the vet no, Julian called her. She was the one who would wash the name Sterling clean with the truth. She walked down the stairs, not as a servant, but as the owner of the house. She stayed in the shadows, watching the $82,000 lights flicker on and the $115,000 worth of guests arrive. The stage was set. The silent storm was about to break, and the Vipers were about to find out that the woman they had stepped on for 32 years was the one holding the gavel. Julian was in the foyer, welcoming the governor and the social elite, his smile a mask of sterling legacy. He saw Martha in her black dress, and his eyes flared with anger, but he couldn't cause a scene in front of his prestigious guests. He hissed at her to go back to the kitchen and hide your face. Martha didn't flinch. She simply looked at him and said, "The truth is, a guest that never arrives late, Julian." He frowned, confused by her sudden change in demeanor, but a senator called his name, and he was forced to turn away. The silent storm was over. The divine reckoning was beginning. Martha walked toward the podium where the memorial gala presentation was set up, her heart a calm, cold fire. The Vipers had had their time. Now it was time for the sacrificial martyr to speak her hymn of justice. Victoria approached her, her fake diamonds glittering under the $82,000 lights. She told Martha that this was her final night of charity and that the New Jersey facility was expecting her in the morning. She mocked Martha's black dress, saying it made her look like a mournful crow. Martha didn't respond with anger. She simply smiled, a slow, terrifyingly serene smile, and said, "I am not mourning the past, Victoria. I am celebrating the future." She then turned and walked away, leaving Victoria in a state of sudden, inexplicable unease. The silent storm had been the gathering of the clouds. The divine reckoning would be the lightning that struck the Vipers down. Martha took her place near the audiovisual controls, her hand hovering over the play button that would change the Sterling name forever. The Vipers were at the height of their triumph, surrounded by the elite of Connecticut, believing they had finally won the bet. They had no idea that the invisible nurse had already seized Chiahua Quinn Look. She had the bank codes, the legal titles, and the recorded confessions. She was no longer a victim. She was the Nu Then Bao who had already signed their bon on. The silent storm was the quietest part of the evening, but it was the most lethal. While Julian spoke of honor and legacy, Martha was silently deleting his access to the digital world. While Victoria drank $700 champagne, Martha was signing the papers that would make the house a public museum for nurses and caretakers. The reckoning was no longer a promise. It was a reality that was about to be made public on the grandest stage of all. Martha looked at the 32 years of pain and felt them transform into a silent storm of absolute clarity. She was ready. The Latin U-shape was complete. She had suffered, she had been betrayed, and she had discovered the truth. Now she would deliver the judgment. The divine reckoning was only seconds away. The Vipers were laughing, clinking their glasses, unaware that the woman they had treated like a ghost was about to haunt them in front of the entire world. Martha pressed her fingers against the cold steel of the control panel, her heart beating with the Latin soul of a woman who had finally found her voice. The silent storm was breaking, and the Sterling legacy was about to be shattered by the truth. The grand ballroom of the Sterling estate was a sea of shimmering silk, expensive tuxedos, and the clinking of crystal glasses that cost more than Martha had earned in a decade. Under the $82,000 lighting rig, Julian Sterling stood at the mahogany podium, projecting the image of a grieving, noble heir. He began his speech, his voice dripping with practiced sincerity as he spoke about the sanctity of the family and the legacy of honor left by his mother, Adelaide. Victoria stood beside him, draped in her $24,000 gown, fingering the sapphire brooch she didn't realize was a glass replica. They were at the zenith of their arrogance, basking in the applause of the Connecticut elite, unaware that Martha was standing in the shadows of the audiovisual booth, her hand resting on the Chiahua Quinn Look. The 32 years, 6 months, and 11 days of her silent suffering were about to end in a divine reckoning that would echo through the halls of Greenwich for generations. Julian invited the audience to look at the screen for a tribute to the Sterling matriarch. This was the moment he intended to use to solidify his image, but as he pressed the remote, the screen did not show the polished montage of Adelaide's charity work. Instead, the silent storm broke with a deafening clarity. The first image was a high-definition video of Julian leaning over his mother's deathbed, his face twisted in a snarl as he told her to die faster so he could put the nurse in the trash. The room went cold. The $75 million smile on Julian's face froze into a mask of horror. Martha stepped out from the shadows and walked toward the stage, her simple black dress cutting through the colorful crowd like a blade of truth. She didn't scream, and she didn't weep. She carried the Latin soul of a woman who was no longer a martyr, but a judge. The screen shifted to a digital ledger provided by Mr. Harrison, showing the $103,000 Julian had diverted from Adelaide's palliative care to fund his personal gambling debts. It showed Victoria's private messages where she joked about the asilo in New Jersey being a short-term investment because Martha would likely expire in the cold. The guests, senators, judges, and philanthropists, recoiled in disgust, their murmurs growing into a roar of condemnation. Julian tried to shout for the security to remove her, but the guards stood motionless. They were the security detail Martha and Mr. Harrison had hired, and their loyalty belonged to the woman who actually owned the house. Victoria began to tremble, her hands flying to her throat to touch the sapphire brooch, only for Martha to speak into the microphone with a voice that was cold, steady, and filled with the power of 32 years of suppressed agony. Martha told the assembly that the Sterling legacy was not built on the blood of the vipers on the stage, but on the invisible labor of those they had stepped on. She spoke of the sacrificial martyr, who had nin en and worked kadam while the heirs spent $42,000 on private security to protect their vanity. She then invited Mr. Harrison to the stage. With the clinical precision of a surgeon, the lawyer announced the secret codicil to the Sterling will. He informed the public that Julian and Victoria had been legally disinherited for their vile and predatory behavior toward both the deceased and her loyal caretaker. He revealed that the $75 million estate was now the property of a public trust managed by Martha, and that the house they stood in was being converted into a sanctuary for retired nurses and victims of elder abuse. The humiliation was absolute. Julian's face turned a sickly shade of gray as Mr. Harrison handed him a notice of foreclosure and a restraining order. The accounts he had been using to pay for the $700 champagne and the $52,000 flowers were officially closed. He was no longer a Sterling heir. He was a man in $2 million debt, a vet neo on the very society he had tried to lead. Victoria began to sob, her fake diamonds mocking her as she realized she had nothing left but the clothes on her back. Martha looked at them, not with anger, but with the serene Q-hun of a victor. She told them that they had lost the bet because they had forgotten that the only true wealth in the Sterling house was the one thing they couldn't steal, her dignity. Martha then addressed the crowd, her words serving as a bon-on for the culture of greed that had allowed the vipers to thrive. She stated that from this night forward, no one in this house would ever be invisible again. She announced that the $42 million in Swiss accounts would be used to fund legal clinics for domestic workers across America. The vipers tried to scramble off the stage, but the divine reckoning followed them to the exit. The guests, once their friends, turned their backs as Julian and Victoria were escorted out by the very security they had thought were under their command. They were left on the gravel driveway in the cold Connecticut night, the doors of the $75 million mansion slamming shut behind them forever. As the crowd began to disperse in a stunned silence, Martha walked back into the foyer. She looked at the marble floor where Julian had stepped on her hand, and she felt a profound sense of walk of freedom. The ache in her back and the chapping of her hands seemed to vanish, replaced by a lightness she hadn't felt in 32 years. She was no longer the Vithen Trungjedin who suffered in silence. She was the woman who had claimed her reward. She went up to her attic room one last time, not to sleep, but to pack her small wooden cross and the journal. She didn't need anything else from this house. She had the divine justice she had earned, and she had the peace of a woman who had finally won the bet. The contrast between her quiet exit and the divine reckoning she had just delivered was the final stroke of the Latin melodrama. She didn't need a grand carriage or a fleet of cars. She simply walked out the front door and into the waiting car of Mr. Harrison. As they drove away from the Sterling estate, she looked back at the $82,000 lights fading in the distance. The vipers were gone, the secrets were out, and the sacrificial martyr had become the architect of a new legacy. She felt the Latin soul within her finally rest. The divine reckoning was complete, and the anthem of her life had shifted from a hymn of suffering to a song of absolute, unapologetic liberty. Martha looked at her hands in the moonlight. They were still scarred, still aged, but they were now the hands of a woman who held the world. She had survived the long suffering and the cold betrayal, and she had emerged not as a victim, but as a Nuthan Bauthu who had chosen mercy over malice by letting the truth do the killing. The vipers would spend the rest of their lives in the Naukalpan house, suffocating under the weight of their own $2 million debt, while Martha would spend her years traveling the world, living for herself for the first time in 72 years. The divine reckoning was the ultimate ban-an, a public bearing of souls that had left the vipers naked and the saint clothed in the gold of her own integrity. The divine reckoning had transformed the Sterling name from a symbol of elitism to a testament to the power of the humble. Martha knew that tomorrow the newspapers would be full of the tragic drama of the Sterling Gala, but she wouldn't be there to read them. She would be in Barcelona, or perhaps the south of France, discovering who Martha was when she wasn't a nurse, a servant, or a martyr. She had won the bet made 40 years ago, and her prize was not the $75 million, but the freedom to never have to nin-an or work kadam for an ungrateful soul ever again. The reckoning was over, the vipers were defeated, and the walk of freedom was her final, glorious act. The Sterling estate would soon be filled with the laughter of retired nurses and the quiet joy of those who had spent their lives caring for others. Martha had ensured that her 32 years of pain would become a sanctuary for those who were still in the silent storm. This was her divine justice, to turn her suffering into a shield for others. As the car moved toward the airport, Martha closed her eyes and whispered a thank you to Adelaide. The sacrificial martyr was finally home, not in a house of stone and greed, but in the sanctuary of her own soul. The divine reckoning had cleared the air, and the future was a wide, golden horizon where the only voice she had to listen to was her own. The story of Martha and the Sterling family serves as a profound testament to the truth that a heart of gold is the most dangerous weapon against a soul of lead. It teaches us that sacrificial martyrdom, without boundaries, is not a virtue, but a slow death. Yet when that sacrifice is paired with the wisdom of divine justice, it becomes an unstoppable force for retribution. The vipers of the world often mistake silence for weakness and servitude for stupidity, failing to realize that those who endure the long suffering are often the ones meticulously documenting the truth. True dignity is not found in a $75 million inheritance or an $82,000 gala, but in the courage to reclaim one's life after decades of invisible labor. Ultimately, the greatest reward is the walk of freedom, the moment you realize you no longer owe your soul to those who never valued your heart.